Good evening. Welcome to the third lecture in the Penn State Department of Landscape Architecture's Bracken Lecture Series. I'm Alex Spangler, Assistant Professor in Landscape Architecture and one of the organizers of this lecture series. The department's annual Bracken Lecture Series is made possible by the generous gift of Dr. John R. Bracken, head of Penn State Landscape Architecture from the 1920s all the way to the 1950s. The series began in 1982, bringing exciting speakers to our department each year to enrich the experience of our students. The Bracken Committee solicits ideas for speakers from both students and faculty, and we are thrilled to welcome Alexa Vaughn this evening. We'll begin by recognizing the history of the lands the university occupies. Pennsylvania State University campuses are located on the original homelands of the Erie, the Haudenosaunee, including the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, the Lenape, including Delaware Nation, Delaware Tribe, and Stockbridge Munsee, the Shawnee, including Absentee, Eastern, and Oklahoma, the Susquehannock, and the Wasatch or Osage nations. As a land grant institution, we acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. I will now pass the microphone to Assistant Professor and co-organizer of this event, Leanne Andrews, to introduce tonight's speaker, Alexa Vaughn.
Thank you, Alec. It is my privilege to introduce Alexa Vaughn. Alexa is a deaf landscape designer and accessibility specialist at MIG in Los Angeles, a 2020 Landscape Architecture Foundation Olmsted Fellow, and two-time alumna of the University of California, Berkeley, where she received her Bachelor of Architecture and her Master of Landscape Architecture. Alexa has a particular expertise in designing for the deaf and hard of hearing community, facilitation of disabled community engagement during the design process, a working knowledge of the ADA standards for accessible design through a landscape architectural lens, and a passion for universal design. Her goal is to create a more inclusive design process and a more accessible public realm that centers the deaf and disabled communities with disabled experts and stakeholders fully participating in the process. She has been published twice in Ground Up Journal, has written for ASLA's The Dirt, LAF's Landscape Performance Series, and advised the ASLA Universal Design Guide. Her deafscape work has been widely featured in publications such as Arc Daily, Curbed, and Elle Decor, the 2020 A-List Architecture. She continues to research and lecture widely about designing with deaf and disabled people, and her most recent work can be found at www.designwithdisabledpeoplenow.com. Thank you, Alexa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Leanne and Alec, for those introductions. I'm very grateful of the invitation from the Stuckeman School to be here today for my lecture through the Bracken series, and just also for the awesome opportunity to do an exhibition, this is my first exhibition that I've ever done in the Rouse Gallery. So today I'll be sharing a combination of my fellowship and ongoing research work in deafscape and universal design, and I'll just be able to answer some questions afterwards as well. So throughout this presentation, I use identity-first language to describe anybody with any type of disability who identifies with a disability, and I refer to people who don't have a disability as non-disabled people. And so I do want to note that person-first language, like people with disabilities, is also completely acceptable. I just personally prefer to emphasize identity and to illustrate that the word disabled or deaf is not a bad word, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Disabled identity is actually really important to the disabled community, and claiming my own deaf identity about 4 or 5 years ago was really empowering for me, and it actually dismantled a lot of internalized ableism that I had against myself at the time. And so claiming disabled or deaf identity can actually hold the same power and create a sense of pride for other disabled folks if they choose to claim that part of their identity. So with that note, one of my primary goals with this work has been to shift how we think and talk about disability, particularly in relationship to the built environment. Currently, the medical model is and has been the dominant worldview, and essentially this views disabled people as the problem. So instead of focusing on issues in the built environment, disabled people are treated as if they need to fix or cure themselves, and furthermore adapt themselves to the built environment. And if it doesn't work out, it's essentially their responsibility to figure it out or just get over it and not be able to access a space. And so as a result of this line of thinking, we often limit our thinking of disabled people's use of space to healthcare, medical centers, and therapeutic spaces rather than broader public space. But obviously this really isn't the case because disabled people are out and about using public space every day. So with this in mind, we really do need to shift to a social model worldview, which views the built environment rather than the person as the problem in need of transformation. And so we shouldn't be forcing disabled people to adapt to our designs. We need to focus on fixing the issues we have ingrained in our public spaces rather than the people who use them. I believe access to public space is a civil right, not a privilege. But today, deaf and disabled people's very right to exist and use public space, let alone enjoy their time in public space, is still being questioned. If we continue to choose to exclude disabled people in our designs, both through process and product, we continue to commit a serious injustice towards these people. And so my time at UC Berkeley actually really influenced my work path. This is an image that took place during the disability rights movement. And this movement took place in large part on campus and around the Bay Area in the 1960s and 70s. And this movement was directly led by disabled people, and this movement is still very alive today. It is not past, but present, and it's moving forward into the future. Also in the 1970s, Professor Emeritus Raymond Liftre led an architecture studio at the College of Environmental Design, which brought physically disabled students into the classroom to critique the architecture students' work. This is obviously not common practice today, and I would really like to see a return to this process in both academia and in our profession. We have a very wide array of legally binding standards to refer to for the design of public space in general, but all of these documents are really overwhelming, and most of them were not developed with direct contributions from disabled people, and also most of us likely haven't even taken a look at most of these documents. So the ADA Standards for Accessible Design, published in 1991, right after the passage of the ADA in 1990, is actually a main guideline for access, of course with additional state laws and codes. But its most recent version was released almost 12 years ago now, so it's not necessarily up to date, but we are still treating it as a catch-all for access across the country. The ADA standards are problematic because they focus very limitedly on the needs of wheelchair users and blind and low vision folks. There's little to no mention of other disabilities. However, I don't want to discredit how crucial these standards are for achieving baseline access to public facilities for the disabled community. Know how hard the disabled community fought for these standards to become a legal requirement, but we also must recognize that there is little to no mention of other disabilities, my own included. And these guidelines are considered standard measurements, and they often focus more so on interiors than public space. And so they're assumed to cover the basic needs of every disabled person, but this really is not the case. We need to start thinking more deeply about this because there are over 1 billion people with disabilities globally as of 2011. And that number continues to rise with population growth as well as aging population growth. And so this number is much larger now. This is about 1 out of 7 people in the world identifying with some sort of disability, and then 1 in 4 to 1 in 5, or about a quarter of the United States population identifying with a disability, so these are significant numbers. When it comes to the disabled community, our Black disabled siblings, particularly our Black queer disabled siblings, are disproportionately criminalized and affected by violence in our cities. It is estimated that disabled people make up 1/3 to 1/2 of all those killed by law enforcement officers, and more than half of Black disabled people in the United States will be arrested by the time they reach their late 20s. And so as a predominantly white woman, I do want to take a moment to recognize my privilege in this community, and I hope that my voice serves to amplify and to encourage others to share their valuable lived experiences and expertise with our profession and with the world. Despite these devastating statistics, the face of disability is often a white wheelchair user. But in reality, disability is a very broad spectrum, ranging from physical to sensory to neurocognitive and mental disabilities. Many folks identify with more than one disability on the spectrum, and this graphic is in no way conclusive of the entire range of disabled identities. And many of these disabilities are invisible or not easily detectable with a general glance. And so some disabled folks will use wheelchairs, canes, or hearing aids, or prosthetics, or glasses, or other devices, while others use none. So disability is not always easy to identify or to understand, but the disabled community is the most diverse and intersectional group of people on the planet, and it's a community that anyone might join at any time. So we really need to account for this cultural intersectionality and diversity, as well as variance in our designs as much as possible, and not assume that only one type of disabled person is using a space at any given time. So jumping into Deafscape now and my own deaf community, I want to illustrate that deafness is also a very broad spectrum. You might have realized I'm using my voice today. I do identify as deaf, but I'm what we call late deafened, and so I'm also a predominantly speaking deaf person. When I was around 8 years old, I became deaf or hard of hearing, and I was actually mainstreamed my whole life without going to a deaf school and without sign language. And I mostly have hearing family and friends, and so I grew up speaking English. And what differentiates mostly, medically deaf from culturally deaf identity with a capital D is the use of signed language. And in the case of the United States, that's American Sign Language, or ASL, and then a shared deaf culture. So I started identifying as culturally deaf about 5 years ago when I started learning ASL for the first time, but I'm definitely in between the deaf and hearing worlds due to the way I was raised and mainstreamed by a hearing family. And so I would just want to stress that my story is unique, and it does not encompass the entire deaf community's experiences. And so many of us coming into deaf identity later in life use a variety of accommodations like captioning and sign language, and not all hard of hearing or late deafened folks will claim deaf identity. And then in addition to deaf identity, there are also other unique identities that stem off of the deaf cultural identities, such as deaf blind and deaf disabled, or even deaf autistic. And so they have even broader, unique identities that stem off of this and cultural experiences. Deafness, like every disability, also spans every racial and ethnic identity. And so there are over 200 sign languages in use around the world. So this is just a snippet of what this all means. So I was coming into my deaf identity, and as a deaf designer, I realized there is a big gap in representation in the ADA standards for accessible design. And really, these just don't include much of anything for the deaf and hard of hearing community as far as designing public space is concerned. And so the only standards provided for us are like visual fire alarms to be provided inside of buildings, TTY phones, which are now pretty much obsolete and archaic, and assistive listening devices and systems, also an interior implementation. And so I want you to notice that these standards are focused mostly on technology and safety rather than general use of public space. In 2011, I actually discovered DeafSpace. And this is my deaf friend, Derek Bemjosa, that I made as a result, who was very involved in the DeafSpace project at Gallaudet University, which is the only deaf university in the world. And so DeafSpace was actually created by Gallaudet's deaf community under the guidance of architect Hansel Baumann in 2010. And it includes many principles to design spaces where deaf and hard of hearing people can not only access, but also flourish. So the DeafSpace design guidelines are also predominantly focused on building interiors, similarly to the ADA standards. The guidelines have 5 main sections, which highlight the importance of providing deaf and hard of hearing folks like a 360-degree sensory reach or understanding around the body, and then having enough visibility and space to communicate with a visual language. I decided to take the first 4 sections of the guidelines and discover how we can apply them to landscape architecture and urban design and create a deafscape. And so these sections are space and proximity, sensory reach, mobility and proximity, and light and color. The article and graphic I created focuses on 8 DeafSpace principles taken from those first 4 sections of the DeafSpace design guidelines, and they're applied to a figurative urban streetscape. And so these are meant to go beyond the ADA requirements and create even more space for the deaf community to enjoy. And really, of course, other disabled groups and non-disabled groups also serve to reap benefits from these principles. They are generally good practices that are not often fully incorporated into urban environments. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on each of these principles and provide a case study, and each of these were designed by my office, MIG. Typically, though, I want you to bear in mind that deaf space principles are not knowingly applied. It's usually kind of a happy accident, and then it's usually in a piecemeal way. So you usually find like 1 to 3, maybe deaf space principles kind of scattered throughout a design rather than a congruent application. So the first principle is a textured transition, and this provides tactile and often visual cues between the sidewalk, planting areas, and the street. And these can actually be felt with the feet while walking, having a conversation, or with a tactile cane, so that it makes it particularly useful for blind and deafblind folks using a sidewalk. And so this is a nice and simple example of a material contrast here, this dark gray area. And so this is really like a darker, just sort of slightly textured concrete material change along the edges of a lighter concrete sidewalk. And this serves as a tactile cue to move along and stay centered on the path. And the project is called Bell Street Park, and it's in Seattle, Washington. And so this type of cue can take many forms, and it can even be narrower or wider depending on the context, or even more pronounced in busier areas as far as how rough the texture is. A textured paver or brick can also be used to create contrast and safety at the edges of curbs. The second is a shoulder zone. And this is a space where people can step off of the main path, just to have a communication, have a conversation, or check phones, or just slow down and rest. And so a good example is the Tower of the Americas Way in San Antonio, Texas. And in this case, you can see there's sort of a textured and visual contrast here to move off of the path into a seating area. There's also room throughout the strip next to that provides room for lighting and trash and recycling receptacles, also planting and bike parking, and just space to step off. And so the key here is that everything is placed away from the main path and doesn't obstruct movement. And so this is actually crucial to avoid any protruding obstructions that might cause injury or a lack of space to communicate. The third is a degree of enclosure. And this is one of my personal favorites because it helps me to feel safe from the back. So deaf folks are very reliant on sight and a 360-degree sensory reach. And so, just to have an understanding of what's going on. And if someone were to come up from behind me and I don't see them, it actually really startles me. And so having a little bit of security at the back is really helpful. So a good example here are 2 types of wooden benches and a sculptural seating nook at Cedars Sinai Plaza Garden, and this is in Los Angeles. And so these allow people to sit and view passersby, but they also provide that desired shelter and security at the back. And this is particularly important, though, on really busy streets, to create calm spaces away from the movement and the noise of traffic. And so these degrees of enclosure are particularly beneficial to the autistic and neurodivergent communities as well, because they can kind of create a little bit of a sensory relief area. The fourth is night lighting, and this is often common sense, but it's so necessary for safety and visibility, again, due to that reliance on sight for communication between deaf and hard-of-hearing people. And so if we can't see clearly, we're actually really unlikely to use this space at night. I've actually had to leave a space at night before because I couldn't comfortably continue conversation. And so it's also important, though, not to have too much glare because that can cause discomfort and eye strain. So a good example is lighting at Yanaguana Garden, and this is also in San Antonio, Texas. They're more whimsical in nature as far as the lighting here, but these provide a really good amount of light, which improves vision at night, but it also appears soft and warm enough to prevent bad glare. And so this creates space for people to safely and comfortably congregate and even play in this instance in the evening. And so when thinking about the right of way, we can still be creative about lighting and should provide a good variety of options to ensure safety at night. The next is flexible seating, and this is kind of another common sense item, but it really does help accommodate conversation more easily if it's flexible and allows deaf folks to keep the line of sight necessary when at the table. And so there's room to move around and adjust those lines of sight. Furnishing should be durable and obviously made with good material so that they last a long time outdoors. The deaf community also does prefer circular U-shaped tables, and this helps us to maintain visibility all around the table with every person that's at the table. And so these are used tables and chairs at Hinghey Park, also in Seattle, and they can be moved around to accommodate different groups of people. So for example, as I mentioned, a deaf person could adjust lines of sight, a blind person could maybe make room for their guide dog, and a wheelchair user could even roll up to the table. And then as far as neurodiverse and autistic folks, they might be able to slightly adjust their seating and accommodate their comfort preferences. And so also, though, of note is the provision of the fixed seating area here. And I think it's really important just to provide a myriad of options in seating to accommodate as many different preferences as possible. So this is a good example of providing both fixed and flexible furnishings. The sixth is a wider pathway. And this actually comes up very often in my conversations with other disabled folks, not just the deaf community. And typically I'll recommend a bare minimum of 10 feet on really busy public sidewalks. 6 to 8 feet can often work in less trafficked areas. But providing space to move is really important for deaf folks to be able to communicate while walking through space and to maintain that line of sight and just generally have comfort while walking, especially since there's so many delivery people and like cyclists and scooters today, so it's important to make that space count. And a really good example of a wide pathway here is at Thornton Creek Water Quality Channel, and this is in Seattle as well. This is a public plaza and a mixed-use development in a pretty busy area, and it provides a lot of space for multiple people to move at the same time. And so even though it does branch off of the public streetscape, I think it's nice to note how lovely and meandering it is and how it's still very connected to the right-of-way. So it provides a nice, calm, and safe pathway to circulate through the area. The next is rhythm, and this creates visual patterns along sidewalk edges, and this actually helps us to move along, and serve the type of a wayfinding, particularly in the peripheral vision or the corner of the eye. And so it's sort of like a subconscious cue to follow while moving through space. An example of a couple of different and commonly employed types of rhythm are here at UCLA and Los Angeles, and they're light posts as well as lines of trees. And so they move through the site, and they stimulate movement through the site, and can use navigation in that way. And so color and style can obviously be employed in light posts and also sculptures to create more eclectic rhythm if desired on streetscapes, and that also helps to provide like a sense of identity and placemaking for the community as well. So the last is a visual cue, and I touched on this briefly because it can take many forms. For example, rhythm is a type of visual cue. But the most important places to have visual cues are actually at pedestrian crossings. And so this includes like flashing light fixtures, painted street lines and crosswalks, and contrasting sidewalks, as well as the bump outs themselves at the curbs. So what this does, it helps increase pedestrian visibility and safety. And so a really good example of a visual cue is at the West Capitol Avenue streetscape in West Sacramento in California. And there's a very clear area created for the crosswalk. So it has color contrast, extended striping, and clear sight lines. And this really just starts to reclaim pedestrian space, and it moves folks along with the design of the crosswalk itself. And so I recently learned, though, that crosswalks that are really abstractly painted, like the mural type of painting, can cause confusion for some folks who are blind, low vision, or divergent, autistic, or otherwise cognitively disabled. And so it is really important to make sure that everything in the crosswalk is very clear and as standard as possible. So for example, the red here that we have sort of zigzagging through here, that does provide contrast for some folks, but others with color blindness or low vision, it might not provide any contrast at all. But what's important to see here is that even though that is red, there's really thick white lines along the edges, and then also yellow truncated domes, which are pretty standardized. And so this really does just play a role in creating that safety and clarity. So in addition to Deafscape, I also have taken a look at universal design. And I'm reflecting back now just on my fellowship with the Landscape Architecture Foundation. And essentially I've realized that universal design's capacity to be used as a creative tool is really where its power lies, because that allows us to look further beyond the ADA. And so most designers aren't fans of the ADA and treat the standards as a limitation and something that is untasteful or ugly in our designs. But universal design can help us to really think more creatively about how we create more accessible and inclusive public spaces and how we can include many more people in the process than we currently do. And so the 7 principles were created by Ronald Mace, and he was a disabled architect and professor at North Carolina State, and he created these in the 1990s. I do want to stress, however, that universal design is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but the principles can help us to start to think more about that huge variance that I was talking about in needs and desires for public space that all sorts of different disabled folks might have within the disabled community. And so universal design principles are very broad and somewhat ambiguous, but their power really lies in their flexibility and their capacity to be used as an adaptive tool. And so this is a sampling of applications for each principle, which might include creating an array of equal options and accessible routes and entrances throughout the design, rather than just a singular accessible element or route, providing an array of options and furnishings, both flexible and fixed, creating simplicity and clarity through color and texture contrast for wayfinding, providing elements that are perceptible through a variety of senses, such as visibly, tangibly, and auditorially, anticipating error and designing well below the maximums and minimums of code, making sure we have options in height and reach to reduce efforts required to use a public space, and providing enough room to move through a space comfortably. And you might notice that many of these principles really do overlap with depth space principles as well. But each principle of universal design really centers access, inclusion, and joy for the disabled community, and that is really the main goal. But there is also a positive net gain for non-disabled folks too if they're applied. However, it's important to note that in order to start utilizing universal design principles, we need to rethink our design process. We can't design for the disabled community without directly including the disabled community. And so the disabled community has a saying, nothing about us without us. And this includes universal design. It is not exempt. We need to identify disabled stakeholders at the very beginning of the process, host accessible general stakeholder meetings with a right array of accommodations, and also host disabled stakeholder focus groups, and accumulate disabled expert and consultant feedback throughout the process. We also should begin to prototype new accessible design elements and test them with disabled stakeholders and experts. And even after construction administration, we need to be willing to continue this process by auditing our designs with local disabled stakeholders and experts to be willing to improve, even if we think we've done everything we can. This process is very much possible. This is an image of a disabled stakeholder group meeting I hosted and facilitated with Olin and Cameron McCarthy in March 2020 for Eugene Town Square in Oregon. And this is right before COVID hit. We came together in an accessible location with a printed site plan. We created a nice, simple tactile plan, which you can see in the right image, which we just used different materials like sandpaper and things like that to create textured contrast. And we also provided braille materials. We had live captioning for myself and other hard of hearing folks there that day. And if you see this green tape in the corner, it went all the way around the room. And one of the folks that was there with us that day was using a hearing aid loop installed to basically stream the microphone to his hearing aid. So it was pretty cool. And we also had material samples provided so that the low vision folks could see like how much contrast was showing up with those materials. And so I've also been helping MIG to facilitate more of these meetings, and we do these for every ADA transition plan process that I've been working on. Disabled community engagement is so important because today, many designers and planners are still practicing outdated and inappropriate methods of measuring access, and this is known as a disability simulation or a sensitivity study. And I recently wrote an article about this for Ground Up Journal issue 10, if you're interested in checking that out. But typically, non-disabled people will try out a wheelchair or a blindfold and tactile cane around the site for a couple of hours and then assume that they have achieved a complete understanding of disability rather than trusting in disabled people's lived experience. So we should not be mimicking or trying out disability no matter how good the intention. Instead, we should conduct accessibility audits with disabled community members and experts in place of simulations. With MIG, I'm actively working with our accessibility specialist team to evaluate outdoor public facilities for citywide ADA self-evaluation and transition plans, which essentially helps cities comply to the ADA as bare minimum by measuring and documenting these spaces as per ADA standard and state codes. And so my coworker and I have assessed over 24 parks, and we're still going, in a large Northern California city. And it's actually just been amazing doing this work out in the field. and really helping cities to become aware of where they can do better to create access and inclusion for the disabled citizens. I just want to illustrate that even though this is really tedious and nitpicky work, it's really quite radical to be doing this work as a deaf person. And in a sense, I'm really just auditing all of these outdoor spaces, and I'm helping cities figure out how to become compliant to the ADA. And so I hope with time, cities will go far beyond these bare minimums, but this is where we start. In addition to transforming our design process, we can also transform our designs. And I've created this qualitative process through my fellowship where we start with the ADA standards as bare minimum, or the foundation to build upon. The next step is to creatively input universal design principles as an adaptive tool. And the final step is to bring in that disabled stakeholder feedback and experts as well through the design process as qualitative control, which goes beyond our typical QA/QC. So an example of this process is an accessible public pathway. So here we assume that the path itself is graded at the proper slope under 5%. But we focus instead on width and space and amenities on that path, which make it both accessible at bare minimum and then beautiful and joyful at maximum. So we could begin with section 403.5.1 of the ADA standards, which essentially just requires a clear minimum 36-inch width on accessible routes. As you can see, it's kind of sad. There's literally only room for one wheelchair user to traverse this path. And there's just not enough space for really anything else to happen. So we can take it another step by considering universal design. For example, the 7th universal design principle here, which requires size and space for approach and use. And so this is a very broad principle. And we can choose to be creative with materials, design elements, and also even usability in general beyond the ADA. And then we can take it a step further by incorporating direct feedback from a variety of disabled community members. I'm aware that reclaiming pedestrian space is a radical act in itself, but perhaps we can adjust further up to 15 feet in some sections if they suggest that this amount of space is essential for comfort. Because we've achieved access, our primary goal, and gone beyond those bare minimums, we've also created a better and beautiful pedestrian-oriented public pathway. So it's really a win-win situation, and this is how we begin to create a more accessible world. So you can find most of this information and work that I've shared today up on my website, designwithdisabledpeoplenow.com. It has all of this information in a series of toolkits and also other resources, which I hope to continue to add to over time. And I hope that they help you to start thinking more about accessibility in your studio projects and also in your practice or future work. And so really each of you has the power to shift how you think about the design process. It's really a choice to start to think about the disabled community and design in radical and inclusive ways, because access to public space truly is a civil right, not a privilege, and we should always treat it as such. And so as designers, we do have that responsibility to be advocates and allies for communities who experience injustice in the built environment. So I challenge and encourage you to be an ally and advocate with and for the deaf and disabled communities. And if you identify as a deaf or disabled designer yourself, I hope you will share your lived experience and expertise with your future employers, with your studio. And so this is just so we can create a more inclusive public realm, and it's really invaluable for you to share that experience, so I encourage you. And thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you, Alexa, for your presentation. That was fantastic, inspirational.
Thank you.
I have many words. So now we are going to open it up for questions and a conversation with the audience. As a reminder, to accommodate our guest here, please speak slowly and clearly so our captioner can capture your questions. And thank you, everyone, for your patience with the expected few seconds delay as Alexa reads the captioning here. Questions? Yes.
Yeah.
As a person with disabilities, how has masks
Still going. Oh, okay. So yes,
Let's
the
try that
question
again.
was.
Sorry, we're all learning here.
It came through, actually, it was just delayed. So yeah, the question was, as somebody with a disability, how has it been able to, how have I been not able to see faces with masks on, right? So yeah, for me, it's been a huge struggle. I rely on my phone captioning app a lot, like in on-the-go situations, and yeah, it's been difficult for sure. Just because as somebody who is late deafened, I do sometimes rely on lip reading a little bit. It's not an exact science. It's actually very difficult to lip read, and not all deaf folks do. But yeah, at the same time, I haven't necessarily wanted somebody to remove their mask in a public situation. So yeah, I've just been encouraging people. Like I literally would type a note and like put it in somebody's face and just be like I'm deaf, I want a coffee, like or something, you know. And yeah, it's been tough. And I've heard from some neurodivergent friends that it's been difficult for them as well, just because it's really hard to read facial cues. But yeah, it's of course like I'm definitely pro-mask. I only took it off to really do this lecture today, and I think that you know, hopefully with time, as COVID starts to dissipate, I don't have to worry about it so much anymore. But I think folks just need to get more comfortable with writing things down instead of talking. So, but good question. Any other questions?
Thanks. What you've presented seems so common sense, and I wonder what the resistance is to your presentation. Why aren't we all doing this all the time?
Yeah, I wonder too. I think a lot of people feel that they have an understanding of universal design, but at the same time, it's like because it's so ambiguous, they don't really have a full understanding of what it means. And I don't think universal design alone is really enough anyways, because folks just aren't bringing the disabled community into the picture, even though it is very doable, as you say, and like common sense. And I think a lot of it needs to be framed more so as common sense, and people just need to be sort of like exposed to different ways of applying universal design and actually like practical ways, because people will say like any type of good design is universal design, but it's not necessarily designed for the disabled community. And when I think of universal design, I think about access and inclusion more than anything, not just something that looks pretty. But of course, accessible design can look pretty and beautiful as well. And so yeah, I'm not quite sure why it isn't being like applied at a larger scale in this particular way. I think it's just really a lack of understanding of what it really is and what it really means, because it's like it's definitely a buzzword right now, but I feel like folks are confused about what it actually entails. So, but yeah, I think it's really only going to be really meaningful and impactful if we do bring the disabled community in to test things out, because you know, if a non-disabled designer assumes that a certain design element works well without consulting with anybody with a disability, that's not necessarily true. And it's like I personally don't make any assumptions about other folks that have different disabilities either, or even within the deaf community, there's some variance as well. So I think it's really just, obviously we'll never be able to fit every single person's needs, and I'm trying to stress that it really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. But I think by bringing as many people into the process as possible, we can really sort of figure out like what is the variance scale here that we can achieve in this project. Because yeah, we're just not including a lot of variance in the process. And I think that's the main problem there. That's why it's not being implemented in the right way.
Are there certain disabilities that are harder to design for than others, and also like depending on where they're located?
Oh, so you mean like groups of folks to reach out to? Yeah, I would say it depends on the resources available. As far as like, so for the ADA transition plans I've been working on, the public entities and cities are required to reach out to as many stakeholders as possible during the process. It's supposed to be like sort of like an open call. And what we do is we give them a list of a bunch of like local disabled organizations. So like the Association for the Blind, the Association for the Deaf, there's some autistic organizations, there's some physically disabled organizations for like wheelchair users and other mobility disabilities. So really it's a matter of, I think, tapping into those resources because we're really everywhere. Disabled folks are in every city, every state, every town. And I think it's just a matter of being able to connect to the right organizations and connecting to the stakeholders. Of course, I think the difficulty is also just getting the message out to certain groups of folks because, you know, there might be like a lack of internet services or other things because actually a lot of the disabled community is also in poverty. And so that's something to consider there as well, just providing alternative formats to get the information out. But yeah, I think it really depends on the situation in that city or town, but there are organizations available to reach out to. As far as like openness, it does depend on the person as well. Like as far as like if they're comfortable participating in the process, I think the whole point is to really get the call out to as many people as possible because there will always be some people that are really comfortable and open about talking about their disability and then others that might not be. So it definitely depends on the person's preferences as well. But yeah, good question. Anything else?
So I was curious, do you personally think architecture students could benefit from taking classes or something in regards to disability culture, as in making it required as a part of the architecture program?
Definitely, yeah. I think they could definitely benefit, and I think it should be a requirement, and it's not a requirement right now. I would say like Leanne is teaching a class that is touching on access in their construction plans, and really like that's not really common at all as far as like actually even putting a sheet in her set that focuses on it. For me, when I was at Berkeley, I literally just, they touched on the ADA with like our topography class and our construction class, but just a little bit. It was more so about like how to grade a slope under 5% or a ramp under 8.33%, and then obviously just in general using like slip-resistant materials. So that was pretty much it. I did take a couple of courses at the electives that were available just kind of randomly at that time, but they weren't required, and like nobody in my class happened to take those classes with me. So yeah, I do think this is the big issue, and I want to see it actually incorporated more fully into the curriculum. So yeah, hopefully that happens. Calling on you, Penn State and other schools, if you're around here today in the Zoom universe. Good question though, but yeah.
I'd like to expand upon that question, Alexa, because I'd like to expand upon that question, Alexa, and thank you for the original question. As a professor that is teaching the fundamental skills where people will go on to become professionals, do you have other suggestions for how we can layer in the information about accessibility into our classes? Given the wide spectrum of disabilities, I can just, I can definitely think of doing my best and pointing into the Universal Design Guidelines, and you've stimulated a lot of great ideas about actually reaching out to people with disabilities. That's a funny thought. Why don't we ask people who have those lived experiences? But do you have any other suggestions that could help with our curriculum?
Yeah, definitely. This is catching up with your last sentence, but yeah, so I think really it's definitely difficult because this is kind of like uncharted territory, and I would say trying to reach out to organizations that I kind of mentioned prior would maybe help out at first, and then of course you do have connections to the Disabled Students Program here, which I actually tapped into that program for the access audit that I conducted yesterday. And of course, it should always be voluntary, but I think providing a little bit of financial incentive for somebody's time is always helpful. And this is something that I've always been a proponent of, just because obviously providing any type of time for a class that isn't your class. But I think, yeah, reaching out to folks that might be interested and just like kind of grabbing a pool of people with different experiences will help. And I think it's definitely worth budgeting for that because it's such uncharted territory and because we don't really have a lot of subjective information about other disabilities other than the deaf space work I've done, and there's a little bit of information on like blind architecture, for example, with the architect Chris Downey has done a lot of research there. But yeah, it's definitely like as far as like the neurodivergent and autistic community and other cognitive disabilities, there's not a lot of research there other than really medically oriented research for like hospitals and like therapeutic spaces, which is really a big part of the problem there. We just don't have a lot of research. So I would say like this is something that I actually want to continue in my own research, or just continue to gather that subjective information that I've kind of started to gather already. But I think if you can bring people into the class, I say by all means do it and just budget for it and see who can join in and just share, because I was trying to stress that everybody's experience really does vary, but like the more subjective information we gather, the more of an understanding we'll kind of have of what their experiences are. And they're really the only experts in that experience. Like, I'm not an expert in any other experience but my own, so yeah. Oh, we have a question back there, I think.
Hi, so what advice would you give to architecture students to think about end users with disabilities at the schematic and pre-design stage versus like, let me just put an ADA ramp, during design development stage?
Okay, so yeah, I think as far as like, so you're saying like the beginning of the design phase versus like sort of like the middle to the end of the design phase. I think the problem is, at least from the practice spectrum, is that we think about access sort of like last minute. A lot of practitioners will literally just be like, oh, I need to go back and like add this ramp in, or I need to like remove these stairs or something like that. And it's like after the design has already developed. And so it's very retroactive in a sense because we're not thinking creatively about access solutions, and we end up just tacking it on as an afterthought. And I think that's part of the reason why so many accessible features in design are not beautiful, because we just throw them in last minute and we hit all the bare minimums and check the boxes and then that's it. And so I would say really starting to think about it at the beginning of the process is really important. Like, I really encourage people to just like make every pathway accessible if you can. Make like every entrance accessible if you can. I don't think that there is like really any limiting factor to that unless you place it on yourself at the beginning. Like if you start designing without thinking about the accessible bare minimums and then maybe even how to go beyond it, we end up again retroactively going back and adding those in. So I think, yeah, I say start at the very beginning and continue it through the process instead of thinking about it at the end or even in the middle, because we really will avoid a lot of issues down the line if it's already thought of at the beginning. And I mean, I know that people have like literally not thought about it the entire process, and then what happens is they run the risk of being sued later if you don't comply with the ADA or state code at the bare minimum. And so what happens is you end up having to fix it later anyway, and it becomes even more costly down the line. So it's something to keep in mind that accessible design, universal design, is the more cost-efficient solution there. So in the long run, it will save you money and it will be really great. We have another question back here.
Do you have any advice for deaf and or disabled people going out into the world and trying to create these accessible environments? Or I should say advocating for themselves to get these places created.
Definitely. So yeah, I am still advocating for myself to this day, and I know how exhausting it can be. So I just wanted to say kudos to any disabled students here that like literally advocate for yourself all the time. Keep doing it. And I think really with time it should become a little easier, I'm hoping, because I think with social media, the one good thing about social media is folks are being exposed to how we live our lives a little bit more than they were when like I was a child, for example, right? I didn't have any deaf role models. I didn't have any deaf friends growing up, and that's why I started identifying as deaf so late. I mean, not super late, but pretty late in life. And I think that I would say continue to advocate for yourself and continue to really share your lived experience, because that is really, I think, what makes us unique. We have a unique perspective to share that other folks don't even know about, you know. So I think really sharing that and being open about it from the very beginning is just going to open a lot of doors to understanding for people, and they're going to want to design more accessibly because they know somebody who has a disability, and sometimes they have to put a face to a word, you know. So that's what I'm trying to do personally as well, and it is a lot, though. It's like, I don't say like overstrain yourself if it's not your calling. So like put yourself out there and be the face of a community. That's okay, but do what you feel comfortable doing, and don't be afraid to do that, because yeah, it's like we're awesome, and I think we have a lot to share with the world. So
Yeah, I think you've partly answered this, but in the event where we don't yet have the curriculum or the collaborations, do you have any recommendations for how students can begin to try to consult divergent experiences when we might not be able to speak with community stakeholders in the context of a school project?
yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, for me, I started doing this research when I was a student, and I sort of, I mean, it does suck in a way that you have to sort of do it on your own time. But if it's something you're really interested in, I would encourage it. And I think, though, that the curriculum in general at any school has started to shift to the social practice side of the spectrum. And so that does kind of work in our favor. And I think really if it's something important to you and you're interested in it, you should study it, and you should try to look into it and incorporate it into your studio projects. Like that was how I started doing it. I actually just took an interest in like the ADA standards and universal design, and what I did in order to sort of put it into practice was I started applying those principles to my studio projects. Just every time I had a project, I would be like, oh, I'm gonna try this out and see how it works. And so that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is if you have the option to do like, I don't know, an elective like research-related course where like you can kind of use your time to do any type of research. I would say that's a good part of like kind of making the time to do the research. It's always hard to make time for any extra work, especially in a pandemic. I did a fellowship during the pandemic, and it was rough. But you know, I think really just kind of starting and taking the steps in that direction. And if you can't find any courses, just make the time to study it a little bit, even if it's just like little tidbits during the week, you know, like figure out, oh, how can I make this pathway better? How can I make this element better? But yeah, it definitely just takes a little bit of time to figure out how to piece it in. So, and if you have the chance to advocate for any classes, like I would say tell the faculty, like, hey, I want this class offered.
Thanks. Can you hear me? So I guess I'm just sort of speaking to a couple of the questions that have come up so far. Hi, Alexa, I'm Joe. So I guess there's a couple of questions. One is some of the questions about like why don't folks do this, or questions like what could we, how there's so many, there's over 150 design principles that come around with the deaf space when you look at the manuals and so on and so forth. It's overwhelming. And then you think about universal design. So I get some of that sentiment that some folks are bringing up right now. But I was curious, what was if you think about non-deaf people, engaging in this process of thinking about deaf space design principles or architectural principles. We're thinking about universal design principles, non-disabled or temporarily able-bodied folks. What was the most surprising thing, or maybe the most curious thing that emerged from your watching them go through the process of engaging with deaf space and thinking about design and architectural principles? What was the most curious or surprising thing you saw that non-deaf or non-disabled folks might have learned by engaging in that process?
Definitely. Really great question, Joe, and it's nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I think that as far as, it's interesting because as Joe mentioned, the deaf space design guidelines have way more principles than I included in my graphic. I took a sampling of them that were most relevant to landscape architecture. Most of them have to deal with building interiors, as I mentioned. But when thinking about the 8 that I blew up in my graphic, I had a colleague that was neurodivergent, and she and I discovered that there were a lot of deaf space principles that overlapped with both of our personal needs and desires for public space. For example, the one that I mentioned a lot is like the wider pathway. And I continuously find that disabled folks just want room to move, room to be comfortable in public space, and like not just one option, but many options, like the option to choose a path, like how radical that might be, instead of just having like one path that's marked for them to use or one entrance. So that's what I found, is that there are definitely things that overlap. I think, though, one example that comes to mind from the past is actually the curb cut. And so curb cuts were not always as universal as they are today. And what I love about the story of the curb cut is that they really started happening a lot in Berkeley back in the 70s. And the disabled community there at Berkeley started literally taking hammers to the sidewalk to start creating curb cuts before they were standardized there. And so what happened, though, was that the wheelchair users were very close to the blind and low vision community, right? And what they discovered was that if they just threw the curb cut at the corner, the blind folks would get confused because they didn't know that it was there. They couldn't feel the change in the curb, and they could fall into traffic if not careful. And so what they did was they started kind of playing around with like, oh, like let's move the curb cut over from the corner. But the problem with that was wheelchair users were too far away from the corner, and it was hard for them to circumnavigate and get back on the sidewalk with a lot of traffic. And so they kept testing and they kept playing around with it. And what they ended up doing was they created the truncated domes that we know today. And so what the truncated domes do are you see the yellow dotted sort of textured paver at the curb cuts. That provides that really necessary tactile contrast at the curb cut so that blind and low vision folks can use the curb cut without any issues. And so I just think that's such a cool story of showing like not every disabled community member will have the same needs as another disabled community member, but we're all sort of like this big team that like wants to help each other, and so we figure it out and we just kind of tinker with the design and we figure something out, which is why I think prototyping is going to be really important down the line to really think about how we can create more accessible elements with direct feedback. And I also think that as far as the curb cut, we have a lot to explore there still as far as like making sure there's enough contrast, because sometimes we don't use the yellow domes because people think they're ugly, and I can agree from a visual standpoint they're not pretty, but they're a safety mechanism, right? Or like the crosswalk, for example, needs to be really clear rather than kind of abstract. So there are just a lot of things to like look at there, but I think really the goal is to figure out what those overlapping needs are and where we can meet them, but also recognize that not every need is going to overlap. There's always going to be a little bit of maybe like conflict there in some different disabled communities, but that if we provide enough variance and we provide enough options in like different sizes, different heights, different textures, things like that, we can accommodate more people than we do now. So it's really just a matter of kind of trying to find that balance. So, yeah. Okay, well, I think maybe move to the gallery then, but that was great. Thank you all for the questions.
I just want to thank you, Alexa, for sharing your expertise and your experiences, and to remind folks, if you are a student, and if the statistics that Alexa said are accurate for this microcosm, there's at least 7 to 15 people in here who likely have a disability. So if you're a student who, that's you, we encourage you, instructors, there's a system where you can register your experiences and your concerns with the university, and we can help you in your instructional process. And we take that so seriously. It's entirely confidential, and we love to do it. So don't be shy about doing that if that is you. And Alexa, thank you again. Alexa has this awesome exhibit over here in the corner, and we invite you all to go check it out. And thank you all for coming.
Awesome. Thanks, Leanne.